Q&A function that you see at the top of the screen. If you choose to put in there your questions anonymously, in case we cannot get to your question during the call, we will try to get back to you after the call. If you are posting your question anonymously, we will not be able to get back to you though. So we will try our best to address all questions that we have, but perhaps the time might not be enough to get into all the questions. So in last EPR webcast, we covered the mandatory regulatory tool, that is EPR, to improve circularity of materials and waste management. We discussed the regulations and explored the challenges meeting the different EPR requirements in different locations for different materials. In today's webcast, we're going to deep dive into the challenges that arise when companies meet EPR requirements for packaging. Today, we're really focusing as well, in particular, on consumer markets, as this is where packaging has the most impact. We will talk about challenges and opportunities in this context. So first, we start with packaging in consumer markets. Then we go into the legal section, where Ismail will explain to us all the legal rules and how they interact ultimately with each other. And then we'll have a conversation on how to tackle the challenges. So with that, Tom and Stuti, may I ask you to please take the lead and tell us something about packaging in consumer markets. Stuti, you're on mute.
Always. Thanks, Monica. So what we wanted to do was, first of all, just make sure we're all on the same page around what we're talking about when we speak about packaging. And from there, we'll give you a quick view on what that means for the value chain before we progress into the next piece around the legal side. So if we go to the next page, so what we've got here for you right now is really looking at what is it we're talking about when we say packaging. If you look at the EU directive, it's got a clear definition. It's all products made of any materials of any nature that's used for containment, protection, handling, delivery, presentation of goods, from raw material through to processed, and from the producer through to the user or the consumer. That's what we would call the legal definition. If you're looking at how companies often talk about packaging, we really hear primary, secondary, and tertiary packaging, and sometimes there's even another level beyond that. So if you're thinking about it, the primary packaging is really the piece that's sold to the consumer. It's the bottle, it's the box that the consumer actually receives. Secondary packaging can be more how it's grouped for presentation on the shelf or for sale. And then tertiary packaging is usually how it's handled in multiple units and how it's transferred from one part of the value chain to the next. And here, I think the key thing is that it covers all materials. So we're talking about typically glass, paper, plastic, and metals. And with that, I'll now hand over to Tom to tell you a bit more about how we see the value chain around this changing.
Thank you, Stuti. As many of you probably know, EPR is essentially trying to drive circularity back into packaging systems. Tracking from right to left on this diagram, there's various ways that this can happen. On the far right, you've got reuse models, either with the consumer or the business user reusing the packaging in situ. The second variant of reuse is where that packaging is returned to, say, the filling line or the bottling line to be washed, quality control, and refilled. And the third variant is where the packaging materials are returned to be either refurbished and effectively upcycled or broken down into the constituent parts and recycled. I think the important point to hold in your mind here, particularly as we move through to the implications of EPR, is what this means in practice for this to happen. And critically, the item has to get back into the system and it has to get back to where it can be recirculated and reused, which sort of sounds reasonably clear when you say it in those terms. But when you think through what that requires in terms of the item being sorted and directed and transported to the right place. So there's sort of an information challenge. Can the item get back to the right place? Secondly, can it get back there economically? So a financial challenge. And then thirdly, can it get back to that location without significant environmental damage? And when you think through all of the different packaging types and all the different materials flowing around, that is a very complex challenge to solve, and really lies below a lot of the challenges we'll discuss at the second half of this session.
And maybe just to add to that, when we're looking at packaging, we're really talking about a material that is something like 30 to 40% of consumer goods companies' carbon emissions. It usually is a cost. We've seen increases in cost across different materials over the past years, something like a 10% increase. And we've also seen shortages, right? During the last years, for example, with aluminium, there's been price increases, there's been problems with getting supply out of China. So this whole concept and thinking around packaging is becoming more and more complicated.
Okay, so I guess I take over here. Very good morning. This is Ismael Aznar. As Monica mentioned, I'm dealing with legal issues. So on packaging regulation, next slide, please. We see EPR as one of the main tools governments are using to address waste concerns, right? So we discussed in the previous webcast the main features of EPR, and we see those features reflected also in the case of packaging, which is one of the main waste flows that we can find. In the EU, EPR regulations address all kinds of packaging, primary, secondary, and tertiary packaging, as it was mentioned before, and also household packaging, commercial packaging, and industrial packaging. The objective is to reduce the environmental impact of packaging when it reaches the end of its life and it becomes waste. That's why if you can see here like four pillars, four main features of the EPR for packaging. I would start with the second one, waste management, because this is at the center of the EPR obligations. Producers of packaged goods or importers of packaged goods have to comply with EPR obligations by bearing the financial and operational responsibility for collecting, sorting, and managing packaging waste, mainly recycling packaging waste. This is the implementation of the polluter pays principle on packaging producers, so that we ensure that packaging waste is properly managed. This obligation can be fulfilled individually, but more often this is done collectively because it's more efficient and costs can be reduced. Second element, and I go to the first pillar here, market access rules. This is perhaps a newer, more recent approach on as regards addressing environmental impacts of packaging. And with EPR regulations, we find more and more now some eco-design requirements, like reducing the measures to reduce the amount of packaging that is placed in the market, or to ensure that packaging is easy to recycle, or that packaging includes recycled content. And those are obligations that are placed on packaging manufacturers and packaging producers of packaged goods, to ensure that packaging placed on the market in the end will have a lower environmental impact. Finally, we have some complementary measures, I would say, other measures that interact with EPR, like, for example, taxes on waste. A good example is the plastic taxes on plastic packaging, for example, as we have in the UK or in Spain, which are taxing single-use plastic packaging to incentivize that this packaging is reduced, and to incentivize also recycling, because recycled plastic is not subject to taxation. We also have other regulations that include obligations which are related with circularity of packaging. We have labeling regulations. We have the EU deforestation regulation, which may impact, for example, cardboard packaging. Or we have CSRD, for example, where we have to report broadly on sustainability, including also on circularity, and that will affect also circularity for packaging and EPR related issues. we move to the next slide, please. Yes, it's also important to identify roles and responsibilities. We will talk later about collaboration. We have already mentioned the role of producers or importers, which are often not the manufacturer of the packaging, which also have obligations, but the producer of packaged goods, which are the main players obliged by the EPRs. They normally comply collectively, as mentioned before, through producer responsibility organizations, which is another key player in the EPR schemes. But we also have local entities, private companies dealing with waste management. We have different players which have obligations or that come into play when we speak about implementing EPR obligations. Normally, EPR regulations also include targets in terms of X% of reduction of packaging, X% of a goal in terms of increasing recycling of packaging. And of course, we have reporting obligations. That data are basic for the implementation of EPR. We need to know how much packaging is placed on the market, how much packaging is effectively collected and recycled. And normally EPR regulations impose obligations on reporting on producers and PROs. Finally, let me mention financial obligations. Typically, the producers have to, as mentioned before, have to take care of waste management, but they do not do that themselves. They normally typically contribute financially to a PRO, to a producer responsibility obligations, which takes care of waste management. The contribution to the PRO may vary, of course, depending on the amount of package placed on the market, but also depending on what we call eco-modulation. So if packaging is easier to recycle, for example, the financial obligation will be lower. And that's also another incentive to introduce circularity in the world of packaging. And finally, last slide, please. Very quickly, we see how regulations and EPR regulations in particular are pushing to move from a linear packaging model to a circular packaging model. If traditionally the focus for packaging was on functionality, on being appealing in terms of marketing, of facilitating logistics, now we see other priorities as well. The former ones were continue to be relevant, but now we have to take into account other topics like eco-design, materials and processes, traceability, supply chain aspects, all related with circularity. I leave it here. Monica, over to you.
Thank you, Ismail. This is really interesting to hear as well, all the legal aspects, and Stuti and Tom, the introduction to packaging. Now we're going into the challenges. So Stuti and Tom, what do you see in terms of challenges around strategy and organization?
Well, I think as you can already see, there's a lot of regulation coming the way of business. And we've already spoken about some of the other things that are happening. So I can give you a bit of our perspective. We haven't thought about how to actually tackle this whole space. And that's what I wanted to take you through. So if you go to the next page, I think that's where it really all comes together. So we sort of spoke a bit about these external factors like the regulations. We haven't spoken about consumers who are increasingly looking for sustainable products that are recyclable or that have been recycled and meet those requirements. We have constant changes in economic and geopolitical conditions, which might affect the availability of packaging materials. I think COVID is a great example. We know plenty of clients that have told us, hey, we actually could not get our materials because we did not have the right arrangements in place with our upstream suppliers, for example. And then there is technology. So if you look at this space, being able to replace or change the packaging we use requires that we have alternatives available, whether it's bioplastics or actually efficient and effective recycling of existing plastics. On the other side of this are all the internal requirements that companies have. Of course, we need to achieve financial outcomes for companies and create value. There's all the sustainability targets that companies have set. In some cases, these are more ambitious than the regulation, but in a lot of cases, they're not as ambitious. And there's a gap between what companies are doing today and what they promise to do. We have quality and safety considerations, particularly when it comes to, for example, food packaging. It's not that simple to say, hey, we move to 100% recyclable packaging, because it also needs to be safe for consumers who are eating those foods. And then finally, there's a question around what capabilities a company has to actually address these issues. Do you actually have the understanding of the regulation? Do you have the relationships across your supply chain to drive change? And within those two areas, with those factors in mind, the way we look at it, there's 4 key action areas. And of course, many of you may be familiar with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. We've really brought that down to what we think are the most relevant things for consumer markets and packaging. And we've put them in what we think is the order that you should really look at them in terms of eliminating impact and creating value. So the first one is really rethinking packaging to go, hey, where can we actually eliminate it altogether? You see innovations in this space coming out. I think P&G recently released a product where the packaging itself will dissolve. It also reduces cost when it's at scale. We then look at reducing packaging, which is more about lightweighting, making things thinner, moving from a heavy perfume bottle to a light perfume bottle. And you can already perhaps guess that that has implications for other parts of the business, and Tom will come back to that in a moment. We then look at reuse. So reuse and recycling, which are a bit more where the EPR is really focused, and some of the other regulations that we see, these areas we would say should really come further down in your consideration set, because reducing packaging actually can actually release a lot of cost benefits. We've seen with clients something like a 10% gain, looking at things like how do you actually transport packaging from your CPG player to a retailer, for example. And that comes to what you see here at the bottom of the page, which is really getting these things to happen requires working across the value chain and thinking through all of the different materials you work with. And with that, I'll hand over back to Monica.
Well, thank you, Stuti. I think this is really very comprehensive and something for organizations and really to look at, right, from a strategic perspective, how you go about it and how you do bridge the gap, actually. Right. So, Ismail, there are 2 questions that did come in. Do you want to take those before we go into collaboration?
And I think it fits perfectly because it's related with the role of different players in when implementing the EPR. I think both questions are a bit like same topic. So which is the player which is obliged to comply with the EPR obligations. And I think it's important to underline that it's not the packaging manufacturer, but the company that places packaged goods in the market. So it can be the beverage company, for example, right, which places packaging on the market. It can be a new company, or it can be a third country company, or it can be an importer of those goods. And I think, as mentioned, that it's relevant for this topic of collaboration, because normally producers themselves cannot comply easily with the EPR obligations. They have to start engaging with other players to make possible that EPR is properly implemented. And in that regard, we mentioned before the role of PROs, which is very important, which is the organization where all producers join forces to ensure a proper waste management. We have the experience of working with the main PRO in Spain for packaging, which is Ecoembes, that is the largest PRO in general in Spain, not only for packaging. And we see the complexity of the different roles of different players and how they have all to collaborate to ensure a proper waste management. Producers and sometimes associations of producers get in contact with PRO, participate in the PRO. Organizing the governance of the PRO is a complex issue, but then PROs have to engage with local entities, with private companies dealing with waste management, with other PROs, because they have to collaborate to ensure that all packaging is properly addressed. And there we have many legal issues. Tax issues have been mentioned, but we also have competition issues, for example, when PROs collaborate. So we have competition law, we have tax law, we have, of course, waste law. We have different legislations that come into play, and different contractual relationships between all the players. So yeah, collaboration is key for the implementation of the EPR. And there are a number of regulations, not only the waste and the packaging regulations, which are impacting how that collaboration has to be carried out.
And so when we hear about collaboration, right, collaboration is never easy. You have strategy, you have collaboration, and then now how do you organize all these things? How do you bring the people together? Who is responsible for what? I think this is always a big question that we are getting asked. Who should do what? Right now, there are a lot of people baking in the kitchen together, but there's really no one that is in charge. So Tom, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, and avoiding the problem that too many chefs can spoil the broth, as we say in the UK. I think unavoidably it's hard, and I don't think we should shy away from that. We've got a simple graphic, I think, a couple of pages back, just illustrating how many different functions would need to get involved. If you pick up on what Stuti was saying about the different ways you can meet the EPR obligations, probably the best way to think about it is to solve a business problem through those lenses, rather than trying to sort of go after sort of reuse for reuse's sake. And that's probably the philosophy which is most useful to bring to these challenges. You can see on this page some color-coded dots showing the intensity of the involvement across different functions for addressing these challenges. And I'll focus on the bottom two rows, reuse and recycle. Typically, the question comes into us and probably arises in your organization, sort of either from the sustainability function or the sort of finance and kind of compliance and legal function. The next group of people that typically get involved are like procurement. People think, well, it's packaging, we need to get the procurement team involved. And then they think, oh, hang on, well, we need to move this packaging around in some form. So organization, operations and supply chains get involved. And then, as Stuti was saying, you realize, well, actually, also, hang on, we need to get the consumer to kind of behave in the right way to get this packaging back and into the system. So typically the journey businesses go on is sort of sequentially bringing in different functions across the business. What we tend to find is it can be more useful to try and get that cross-functional involvement early, because the solution requires a bit of input from all of the functions. I think to do that realistically inside complex organizations like yours, you need to have senior buy-in and leadership around these topics, and direction to say across functions you have to get involved in this. I think secondly, you need a language around EPR and solving this problem which isn't too technical. The lawyers are an incredibly important voice in the room, but this has to be communicated with the business in its own language. So when talking to the sales team, sort of talking to them about pack mix, range architectures, channel choices, different consumer groups. When speaking to the finance team, this is about the cost of the systems and the return on it. And the more that these issues can be discussed in the business, sort of in the language of the business, the more we find it gets traction. And then the final observation I'd make around sort of organization is it's surprising how often the different functional teams will pick this up and run with it themselves, sort of once they sort of understand it in terms of their own function. So a lot of the time we find the solutions to which channels, which consumers, which products, which price points work for this. It's not coming from the sustainability team. It's not even entirely coming from us as advisors. It's coming from the sales team and the commercial team sort of getting it and realizing, oh, okay, that consumer over there will behave in that way. Or it's much easier in a closed loop environment like a restaurant or a pub for the the packaging to sort of not get out into the wild and kind of get back. So really bringing them in to help you solve these problems makes your life easier, and we find gets to better solutions. The next page I'll touch on very briefly. I won't go into the detail, but just to emphasize the point, going back to Ismail's point about collaboration, that this need to work together isn't just within your own business, like you see on this page. It's along the value chain, because you've got to get these products back to you and this packaging back to you. It has to be processed, and there's data considerations around it. It's potentially got to be reworked by the producers and the manufacturers. So you've got this sort of matrix of organization required at the business level, and then along the value chain as well. As Ismail pointed to, producer responsibility organizations, either sort of formally mandated or informally brought together, can be a good way of doing that. The other way, frankly, which works pretty well, is setting up value chains where the financial incentives do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So we don't see this quite as much in packaging, for example, at the moment. But if you think about consumer electronics, it is a good example where there's a lot of circularity and effectively reuse of products and recycling of products, not primarily because for environmental reasons, but because they've got the economics on the value chain to add up, so that those financial incentives are really pushing the products and items to the right location. Much harder with packaging because you're starting with a lower value item, but the more you can get those financial incentives well aligned, the easier it is to get collaboration along this chain.
Well, this is really, I think a big element that you mentioned as well, getting the various parties early in the process, Tom, and having them speak together at the same time, having each one of the involved parties understand it in their language of why it is important and what it means. So now, Ismail, you with your legal lens on it, when you're looking at collaboration and what are the challenges then to translate that legal language and bring it to the other teams?
Okay, no, yeah, we see different challenges when implementing the EPR regulations for packaging. From our experience, our most recent experience, for example, one of the issues that we see is that it's becoming the landscape is becoming more and more complex. We have moved, for example, in Spain, from a system where we had EPR only for household packaging to an extension to commercial and industrial packaging. So we have businesses which were not impacted before because they were not producing for B2C channels for the consumer, but which are more in the B2B business. And now they are impacted by the EPR. And we are moving from a system where we had a big PRO, which is EcoEmbes, dealing with household packaging, now moving to a landscape where we have several PROs, more specific, dealing with commercial and industrial packaging. And one of the issues precisely is how should we, when you are a producer of a product, of packaged products, very often they ask themselves, how should we address the EPR? Is it better to join an existing large PRO, which is maybe more efficient and more powerful, or should we create our own PRO more focused on our business and our specific targets and adapted to our specific regulations? So it's having the right advice in that regard and the right understanding from a strategic but also legal perspective, it's key. And it's becoming also very important. I think it's relevant to mention that in this process towards a more circular model, the access to recycled materials. And that's where also producers and PROs are positioning themselves with companies dealing with waste management and so on, to make sure that they have access to those materials. Because on the other side, at the beginning of the process, you have eco design requirements, and you have to incorporate recycled materials to the packaging. So it's becoming progressively complex, but I would say it all makes sense if you understand that this is all about moving to a more circular model.
And maybe something to add there, which I think Ismail hinted at, is that there's also a cross-industry element here. So we're talking about consumer goods companies, but there's also the waste management industry here who needs to actually collect this and also has to make some money out of the processing of waste materials. And that's increasingly becoming a challenge as well, because we know there's going to be requirements around what you can and can't export in terms of waste outside of Europe. So there's expected to be more supply within Europe, which will create some pressure also on how much money companies can make out of this whole process. So it's increasingly becoming a more collaborative space where companies need to work together to drive this forward.
Very briefly, you also have the local entities. So also from a legal angle, you have an interaction between private law, in the relationship between producers and PROs and companies responsible for recycling, but also public law, because you have relationships also with the local entities and agreements between local entities and PROs.
Yeah, so this is really, I think, an important part. And now when you think about, organization, Tom, so what does this mean, what we just have heard? And you're on mute.
I think to some extent we're sort of in the foothills of this in a lot of countries across Europe and across sectors as this collaboration sort of happens much more. I think that there does need to be sort of an initial sprint and sort of call to action, sort of a lot of companies and across industries around these topics. So getting the right principles in place, the right legal basis in place to sort of work together across industry, and then, as we sort of talked about, internally getting the right structures in place to kind of collaborate around this. And then hopefully what we'll see is this gets baked into business as usual sort of much more over time. But clearly there's a period where leaders like yourselves will need to be sort of more active in sort of setting up these structures internally. I think you'll find, though, that the government and the rest of the value chain, whilst there's always a bit of noise when these things change, they will appreciate sort of the leadership shown on these topics. The regulators don't have all of the answers here, and they're often looking for industry to help shape workable solutions. Other parties on the value chain, like the retailers, who might not have quite the same legal obligation on them as Ismail pointed out, as the people placing the materials on the market, will also appreciate some sort of quite thought through leadership shown on these topics, and investors as well. There's a lot of money trying to help build the infrastructure and the systems and the logistics and the new commercial models around this, but at the moment they're struggling to make those investment decisions because there isn't the certainty about how these models will work. So I think we've been through some of the specifics, but the headline really is sort of showing leadership to the rest of your businesses, but also to the rest of the value chain, can really help this snowball to start rolling. And I think you'll find 9 times out of 10 you'll come across quite enthusiastic and sort of collaborative partners around this.
That's good to hear, Tom. Thank you. So if we then move into value chain, the impact on the value chain, if we can go to the other slide, please. Right. So here you can see all the aspects around the value chain. We heard a lot about strategy, organization, collaboration, and what it does in relation to packaging, the design that you have to look into, the sourcing, the waste management. So they're all functionalities that need to take into account all these changes and the potential IP that might be created through R&D, different types of collaborations, which create all sorts of other questions. And so I think from a corporate income tax perspective, clearly there are impacts to be taken into account. There are opportunities that arise out of EPR to rethink certain things and what is the impact really on your business model and the related tax consequences. There is also an impact, obviously, from an indirect tax perspective. As soon as you're touching your value chain, you might move products differently, have different types of functions doing different things. So Claudia, like, what is it that you see from an indirect tax perspective that really needs to be taken into account in any kind of efforts in this context?
I think that we are already giving quite an example that you also see in real life. As soon as you start moving stuff around, and I think Stuti also referred to it, you have to take into account, can you export it, can you import it, what do we have to do when it comes to transaction, how are we going to report it? And I think the feeling of the average indirect tax person or customs purpose is we are included late in the process. So everything is designed, everything is settled, and then sometimes from an indirect tax perspective, someone has to say it is impossible because we cannot export, the value is incorrect or whatever. So I think what is important, since, and I think it was said on all kind of plastic and packaging, I think it is important to also include at least the indirect tax people as of the beginning, because it's important that you have in some case authorizations, registrations, and for an indirect tax person, and a lot of the indirect tax persons are also dealing with the plastic tax, it would be good for them to understand where can I find the data, how can I obtain a report, etc. They are at the end after the event occurred, but it's still really nice if they know what to report and when to do it. And that's also, be frank, if in a business a product is already moved from A to B, and then after 3 months you are going to ask, can you please provide me the details? Everyone is already working on the next shipment. So getting some time 3 months after the product is actually shipped is normally quite challenging. So I think my takeaway is from practice is make sure you include the one that will be filing reports, the one that will be filing the returns potentially, but also take into account the people that are involved for customs, because one can be, if it's qualified as waste, it's difficult to export and to import, but it's also how are you going to value it? Exactly to the point that was made previously, for you it's waste, for the one that is actually in the recycling, it's their asset. So that you really need to be strongly aligned and make it right for everyone. So don't forget the indirect tax people and include them after you design the whole process.
Yeah, thank you, Claudia. I think it's definitely something. It's a integrated team. So when we talked about organization, Tom, earlier, having all the stakeholders at the table, I think tax, direct and indirect taxes obviously also should be there. Now, I have a question to all of you, perhaps to Ismail as well. So when you, what is the timeline for EPR? Like, is there a specific urgent need, or do I have to work towards a special date? Is there a drop dead date?
Well, EPR for packaging, at least in the EU, is already in place. So companies should start complying already. The revision of the packaging directive in 2018 introduced the EPR for all kinds of packaging, household, but also commercial and industrial packaging. We are now in the process where in our case, at least, I mean, now I'm speaking about Spain, which is a reality I know better. We already had before EPR for household packaging. Now we are in the process of implementing the EPR for commercial and industrial packaging. The PROs, the producers are engaging with PROs. They are joining PROs, and PROs should start operating by the end of this year. They have submitted their applications to be authorized as such as PROs, and they will start acting from the end of this year.
Yeah, well, I guess it's a call to action for everyone to get involved and to ensure that there is alignment as well and a clear strategic outlook, as well as being compliant. I would like to thank everyone for having participated. You can watch our webcast again. It will be made available and you can rewatch it again. There was a lot in not a lot of time that we had to go through. Our colleagues from Strategy and would be delighted to have a conversation with you to talk about strategy and organization operationally. How do you make it work? We from legal, tax, direct taxes, indirect taxes, really are hoping that you have learned something today and that we can as well help you in terms of how do you go forward. And we all work together as a team, together with you. So really hoping you enjoyed this webcast. Thank you to all the speakers for the time and effort that went into it, and great learning points for us all of around the topic of EPR today. Thank you so much and see you soon.